Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we'll be taking a close look at the wonderful, wildly underrated landscape drawings of the 18th century French painter Jean-Honoré Fragonard. This is an artist who is primarily known for his sensuous, decadently decorative paintings such as The Swing. But his series of landscape drawings done in red chalk during his studies in Italy, while still full of the characteristic playful inventiveness, are much more restrained and classically composed, and deserve to be better known. And since the very best way to study from the masters is to do a copy, we're going to reproduce a portion of this incredible drawing as closely as possible in order to see what principles can be learned from the process and applied to our own work. Let's get started. Fragonard was born in 1736 in southeastern France and moved to Paris at a young age, where his talents were recognized by another giant of the Rococo, François Boucher. After studying briefly under Chardin, he entered Boucher's workshop and absorbed his master's style so thoroughly that he eventually was entrusted to create replicas. At an extremely precocious 20 years old, Fragonard won the Prix de Rome, which allowed him to study in Italy, which is where he created his masterpieces of landscape drawing in red chalk. These drawings were done on site and were not only brilliant in of themselves, but also served as a wellspring of inspiration that Fragonard drew from after his return to France. Fragonard's lush paintings enjoyed the patronage of a decadent, pleasure-loving aristocracy, but with changing tastes and the French Revolution, he fell out of favor. His work was largely forgotten for much of the 19th century, but with the rise of the Impressionists, who saw in Fragonard as a forerunner in his use of brilliant color and expressive brushstroke, he became more appreciated. In our more restrained age, his paintings are divisive, with many people viewing them as frivolous and garish, a product of an age of excess and exploitation. I personally love them, and some of my favorite works are the series of 4 canvases titled The Progress of Love, which were created for Madame du Barry, the last mistress of Louis XV. Are they over the top? Yes, but wonderfully so, and the billowing vertical landscapes are painted with an unmatched delicacy of color and vitality. Before we start our copy, let's talk about materials, starting with the paper. Most of Fragonard's drawings were done on a light, warm gray laid paper. For those of you unfamiliar, laid paper is a type of handmade paper with a slight gridded texture created by the wire mold used in its manufacture. I don't have any at hand, but I don't think that's a strict requirement since we're not making a replica. Any good quality paper with a medium tooth and a light gray tone will do. A commonly found option is this Mi-Tiens line of papers made by Canson. The color eggshell or lily would be a good light gray option. Another higher quality option is this Canson Editions Wheat, which is a printmaking paper that I often use for my pen and ink drawings. However, one of the benefits of being an artist for as long as I have is that I have an accumulation of all different kinds of paper in my studio, and this decades-old paper from God knows where seems to be the perfect color and texture for this purpose. The choice of red chalk is tricky because Fragonard uses natural red chalk for his drawing, which is a naturally occurring form of hematite. This dense, hard material, whose use goes back to the early Renaissance, has a unique combination of properties. It's really hard, allowing for sharp, precise detail, and yet soft enough for delicate atmospheric shading. The problem is that, as far as I know, the sources of high-quality hematite used by the old masters was completely exhausted by the end of the 18th century. And while you still can buy natural hematite for drawing purposes, I found that it's always full of impurities, little inclusions that make it virtually unusable. And unfortunately, none of the modern substitutes quite match up. A statement I can make with full confidence because I have at least a dozen different red chalk pencils in my studio and have, over the course of my practice, tried many, many more. From my experimentation, I found that Conte Sanguine and other chalk-based sanguine pencils are too soft and smudgy, quickly losing their points and making sharp detail challenging. While many of the oil-based sanguine pencils are great for sharp detail, but are too hard and lack contrast and the ability to create soft atmospheric effects. But rather than giving up hope to ever match the natural red chalk's unique properties, I hit upon an ingenious, albeit imperfect solution, combining Conte red chalk pencils with Kohinoor oil-based sanguine pencils. The softness of one and the hardness of the other should give me everything I need to at least approach some of the effects in the drawings of Fragonard. I should note that oil-based and chalk-based materials usually don't play well together, and if I start with the oil-based pencil first, it will resist the chalk-based pencil. However, I think this incompatibility will not get in the way, and so long as I start with a chalk-based pencil first, and then place the oil-based pencil on top, we should be okay. Let's start on the copy and see how we fare. Okay, I have my Conte and my Kohinoor oil-based sanguine pencils ready to go. They've been sharpened with an X-Acto knife. You can also use a box cutter for this purpose. And then I have a little metal file next to me in case I need to re-hone the tip of the pencil, something that saves a little bit of time. To do my erasing, I'm going to use a regular white nylon eraser. It seems to work best for this purpose. And then here's an additional trick. I have a little reservoir of water. Why? Because both the Conte and the Kohinoor pencils react when dipped in water, becoming a little bit darker, which is going to extend my range of contrast. Now, originally in the field, you can wet the pencils with the tip of your tongue, but I think that's a little bit disgusting. Nobody wants to see you lick your pencils while you're drawing. I recommend having a little reservoir of water at hand. Okay, let's set that aside and begin our drawing with our Conte red chalk. I'm going to start the drawing with the Conte red chalk and begin by defining very simple shapes. Neither material is particularly easy to erase, but I think the Conte is a little bit more erasable than the oil-based real chalk. However, if you're working light in both, they're equally erasable. So I'm just going to define the overall shapes very lightly. Okay, we have something that looks like this. Just doing a bit of contour drawing here. Okay, we can also indicate just a little bit of the foreground. These are elements that I'm going to put in later, but just to have them in. All right. Then the next step is to put in my contours. Again, I'm going to use red chalk for this. One trick for using very soft materials like red chalk or pastels or pastel pencils, if you want a sharp line, keep rotating the pencil as you draw. So as I'm putting down the line, I'm rotating. This allows you to get sharp lines even if your drawing material is relatively soft. That said, I'm not going to worry about getting lines too sharp. That's going to be the role of my oil-based pencils, which are a lot sharper, easier to get thin lines with. Okay, hopefully I'm getting all this right. Okay, then I'm going to go around and capture a little bit of the contour. Now, one thing that's absolutely brilliant about Fragonard is his sensitivity to different kinds of contour. He never outlines. His lines are always very carefully varied, very carefully observed. So if we look at this bundle here, he's using the side of the pencil and working with soft strokes. Then he's got a darker value. Then he goes to something very, very light. Then all of a sudden he has some leaves. Again, he's using the flat of his pencil here to create this texture. Fragonard is always changing things up, which is indicative of something that is very common to old masters. They have incredibly inquisitive, active minds. They're constantly responding, reacting, and changing up their strokes, their color, their texture. Right? Even a simple drawing where we have nothing but a simple outline is going to have a number of different kinds of lines, varied contours. Right? There's almost this hyperactivity when it comes to the variety, which creates a very stimulating effect. It makes a drawing that is very energetic, because one of the worst things you can do in drawing is make everything the same. So take the huge variety of textures that we're seeing and make them all similar, which is, again, a distinguishing feature of old masters. They never turn off their brains. Their minds are always incredibly active. Whereas a beginner or a lesser artist, such as myself, we turn off our brains and then we go into autopilot, which means that we create textures that are all the same. So as opposed to the 50 different kinds of textures, perhaps I'm exaggerating. But, okay, there's a dozen different textures here, different kinds of plants, different kinds of leaves, right? I create one or two, which makes the drawing a lot less interesting. So he is creating soft strokes here, and then turning his pencil on its edge, and we've got some sharp, kind of squiggly kinds of lines. Even if the textures he's creating are not entirely faithful to what he's seeing, it's going to create a much more interesting effect. So there's a tremendous amount of variety. And by the way, this applies to all drawing, whether it's the figure, or a tree, or a simple object, right? A true master will always keep things moving. I would say that is one of the most important principles that can be derived from this drawing. And it obviously goes beyond medium. So whether you're working in pen and ink, this channel primarily focuses on pen and ink drawing for the most part, right? Or working in graphite, or working in watercolor, keep things moving. That's an important principle. Keep things changing, keep the color moving, keep the values moving, keep reacting, keep responding, keep adding visual interest into your drawing. So I'm focusing a lot on contour because it's so important to what makes this drawing successful. It really is the key. It's a relatively small drawing. It's, I think, 9 by 14 inches. That's it. It's absolutely packed with information, with atmosphere, with detail. That detail is very lightly, loosely rendered, but it's very specific. There's a lot going on. One very important principle of picture making that I almost use as a mantra. It's one of the things that I talk about to my beginning students, is to introduce variety. Introduce variety in all of its forms. So if you're using color, variety of color, very important. Variety of value, variety of texture, variety of shape. Obviously, not the be-all, end-all of picture making, but it's one of the filters which you should be using, thinking through your image as you're composing. Right? Do I have enough variety? Is there enough going on? Again, lots of different kinds of variety of scale. So part of the effect of this image is the variety of scale, this giant outcrop of trees against this relatively flat horizontal landscape. Variety of depth. We have something that's really close contrasted with something that's much further away, much lighter. Concentration of detail. A lot of detail contrasted with areas that are very, very loosely rendered right next to them. Right? A lot of different ways variety can be interpreted. That's the great thing about this rule, is that it transcends style, transcends medium. Really applies to sketches like this. Okay, this is a slightly more finished drawing, but it's still a sketch, right? It's not fully rendered all the way through, right? I'm paying very close attention to variety. Now, this is a copy. I'm working relatively slow, being relatively methodical. Copying is, in some ways, easier than making an original work of art, in that everything's given to you. All you have to do is copy. In some ways, it's more difficult, right? Because you're not inventing. Everything has to be really tightly adhered to. Fragonard is known for being very fast. So how long did a drawing like this take him? I think we would find ourselves ashamed with a comparison. This drawing may have taken him just a few hours, maybe even less. Right? It's actually done very, very quickly. The strokes are very energetic, high speed. Right? You can almost feel the speed at which Fragonard is working. And another really important quality, which is going to be very difficult to achieve in a copy. Nothing feels belabored, right? A lot of detail. Everything's very fresh. He's not making corrections. He's not going over lines excessively. When you're doing a copy, that's one of the things that get lost, the spontaneity. Right? I have to work a little bit slowly, more slowly than I would if I was doing an original work. But here is the general principle of copying. Unless you're commissioned to make a replica, there's absolutely no benefit in being perfectly faithful to the drawing. In a drawing like this, it's relatively impossible, unless I go stroke for stroke for stroke. Seek out principles. Seek out the artist's thought process, and think about how that could be applied to your own work. So a few things I'm noticing. First of all, this is a universal lesson that I learn every time I copy, just how specific the artist is, right? Just how inventive they are in terms of introducing variety. That's a perennial lesson that I learn every time I copy. The other lesson that's specific to this is just how impressionistic Fragonard is. From a distance, all these strokes come together into detail, but really up close, they're incredibly impressionistic, right? He's using a lot of strokes to suggest detail which really isn't there. This is not an image that is over-rendered, right? This is not an academic drawing where every single leaf is fully rendered out. What he's doing here is creating the illusion of complexity by changing the strokes, by being very responsive to different kinds of textures. And Fragonard is not only responding to different kinds of trees. So for example, here in the cypress tree in the center, we don't have leaves, we have fronds, kind of semi-needle-like structures. Towards the sides, peeking out, we have leafier trees, I'm assuming. Right? He's changing up the texture. But he's also responding to depth. So at the sides, you notice that the textures are softer. They're more lightly rendered. They're actually perhaps even a little bit smaller. And then towards the center, he starts concentrating the contrast. So the textures towards the center become a lot stronger. So he's very carefully modulating, regulating the texture in response to depth. And for that, you always have to consider where the closest objects are to the viewer. So where is the viewer? Well, probably at eye level here, right? Where's the closest area? Here. So here we have the strongest contrast, and then going towards the sides, the tree wraps around, disappears into the distance, and then towards the top also. So notice that the contrast is really focused mostly here. That gives you a very strong sense of depth. Again, this goes beyond medium. This is something that I've discussed in my several tree drawing tutorials. And really, this applies to any texture. When you're applying texture, pay attention to where that texture is closest to the viewer and where it's farther away. Okay, so hopefully I got some of the texture. I'm missing a little bit of the sharpness, but keep in mind that I'm going to, at some point, switch over to my oil-based red chalk and get some of the sharpness that I'm not able to get with my Conte red chalk. One, two, three, four, five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we've done the contour. We've put in some of our basic shapes. Let's do a little bit more here. So we've got these very strong diagonals in the foreground. We'll talk more about some of the compositional tricks that Fragonard is using here in a little bit. Even though this is a fragment, this is not the entire drawing, obviously. We can just very lightly suggest a little bit of the landscape. These things are done very, very lightly. This is where natural red chalk has a tremendous advantage. You can use it very light and very sharply, whereas with this synthetic chalk-based red chalk, you can work light, but it's very difficult to get really sharp lines. Okay, so we're just going to very lightly indicate it. We want it there. Right? That's an important principle. Whenever you're drawing, make sure the entire composition is there before you start. This needs to be lower, right? This goes this way. Before you start putting in details, always, right? Don't throw yourself in the detail without knowing what the composition is. That's always, always a mistake. Not a lesson we need to learn from Fragonard. This is something that's sort of general education stuff that we learn in beginning drawing, but an important lesson nonetheless. Even in a study like this, where we're dealing with a fragment, this is an opportunity to also practice our overall general skills in composing. And one of those skills is making sure that you're blocking things in before you're committing to detail. Right? To always be systematic in the way you work. Always. Okay. What is the next step? I think the next step is to go over this entire outcrop of trees with a tone of red chalk. I'm going to continue using the Conte, and what I'm going to do is block in the general values. So the red chalk is darker here, it's getting a little bit lighter here, and then Fragonard is absolutely brilliant in defining the overall form of this very complicated outcrop of trees. Notice that this side has a little bit of a lighter value than this side. Why? Because light is coming from this direction. We've got a fairly strong light source. So I'm going to start off with just the general value here. I notice that Fragonard is hatching from the top down at about a 45-degree angle. So this tree has actually a very strong diagonal impulse to it, direction. And one thing to notice is that there's no stumping, there's no blending in this drawing at all. Right? Everything is left very, very sharp. Everything's picking up texture, which I think is another fairly important principle. Red chalk drawings can be stumped. However, in many cases they're not. And I think it's an advantage. Why? Because red chalk is naturally a lighter material. It has lighter contrast. By leaving it unstumped, it creates an energy to it. Whereas if I stump it, it might end up being too soft. This is not an issue with charcoal, which is a naturally dark, contrasting material, but it is in red chalk. So often, when you look at old master red chalk drawings, there's no stumping. So I'm talking about the drawings of Michelangelo, the greats, Da Vinci. Right? Those red chalk drawings tend to be fairly sharp. They're not linear. They have an atmospheric quality to them. But they're not blended. They don't have that softness that a lot of black chalk, sometimes charcoal drawings, graphite drawings can have. Blending, stumping, is not always good for a drawing. Sometimes it can actually make the drawing weaker, believe it or not. Too much softness, not a good thing. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that this Conte red chalk is picking up a lot of paper texture. This is one of the disadvantages of this chalky material. It's rougher. It doesn't have a greasiness like the oil-based pencils do, or actually the natural red chalk. Now, I'm not saying that natural red chalk is greasy, but the pigment particles are very, very fine. The naturally occurring hematite has a very fine grain to it, much finer than the grain in synthetics. It's smoother, it's buttery. The only problem is that, again, the modern equivalents are full of grit, so it's buttery, but only for a second. So you get a sense of how good that material is when you use natural red chalk today, but only for a second, because every other second you catch a piece of, I don't know what, some kind of inclusion, and it catches, it stops drawing. So you find yourself every second getting rid of a bit of grit. It makes drawing impossible, or at least incredibly annoying. Okay, let's go over this one more time. We have a darker value here, and all this stuff is going to be, as I apply texture, smoothed out a little bit. And by the way, Conte Red Chalk also has some grit in it occasionally. It'll occasionally catch. So it's also not a perfect material, far from it. You would think in our day and age that Conte would have figured out a way to get rid of the inclusions in their synthetic product. Maybe nobody really cares but me. It's possible. Okay, so I'm looking at the overall value here. It's darker over here. This is a little bit darker too. I'm trying to get that diagonal energy. So one thing you'll find is that this Conte Red Chalk has a tendency to blur out all by itself. So the second layer loses that sharpness. Right, we're losing that sharp linear quality that exists in this drawing. Again, we're going to use our second type of red chalk to see if we can get it back a little bit. But this, again, is the main disadvantage of Conte Red Chalk. It's actually a material that is not as good for sharp lines, and generally better for larger drawings, not for detailed drawings like this. Okay, so we have the overall value, I think, or close to it. We have a lot of texture, but I think we've got a good setup for the next step, which is to use our second type of red chalk to introduce detail and some of the textures in the center of the image. So let's do that right now. I'm going to go around the contour and get a little bit more specific about what I'm seeing. Oil-based red chalk, as mentioned, has some advantages over the Conte. It's a much harder material. It tends to be a little bit darker in value, but it's also a harder material. And one of the disadvantages is that it doesn't layer quite as well. So it tends to be better in one layer, two layers. After a while, for whatever reason, it sort of seals the paper fibers. It makes the paper very slick and prevents any more of the material to stick to the paper. I guess that's the best way to describe it. Even though the material is darker, right, you can see in terms of the value, right, it actually goes a little bit darker than the red chalk. In practice, it doesn't actually go quite as dark, believe it or not. Why? Because it doesn't layer as effectively. It's much better for smaller drawings. However, it works much better when it comes to sharp detail and sharp lines. So this kind of stuff I'm going to reinforce using my oil-based red chalk. Hopefully by the end of the drawing, these two materials are going to integrate with each other perfectly. You're not going to be able to see the difference between the two. They're fairly similar in color. But one thing you notice about natural red chalk is that it has a natural color variation to it. So in its lighter aspect, it's a little bit more orange, and in its darker aspect, it starts going a little bit more purple. Maybe because the material itself is not perfectly uniform in color, but I also think that's just the natural quality of red chalk in that it just has this magical color variation to it that synthetic materials simply can't access, just don't have. The oil-based red chalk also has a tendency, because it's harder, to work itself a little more effectively into the paper fibers. So I think what you'll see is that the texture is going to soften a little bit as we're working. So we're not going to see some of the strong textures, and we're going to be able to reintroduce some of the sharp linearity, line quality that runs through the image. I'm hoping. Let's see how it works. Okay, so again, I'm being specific about the outline. And by the way, what I'm doing with the pencil is I'm creating a chisel point. So this is something you can do on a separate sheet of paper. Right? Take your pencil and flatten it out. That's going to allow you to create some of the leaf textures that you're seeing in Fragonard's drawings. So these kind of flat shapes are done with a chisel point. Now, Fragonard was not using a pencil. I believe they didn't exist at the time. Right? What you had are crayons, sticks that were held with brass. Let's see if I can find one here. Here's one. These kinds of things, right? So you had a material and it was held in one of these holders. And they're relatively thick, right? These sticks. And the way he was able to create these textures is by having a flat point and rotating it. So that can be done very effectively in creating all kinds of organic textures, right? So you can... Am I doing this in the right place? I think I am. Right, to use the flat to create leaf shapes and then rotate your pencil upside down. You can almost feel him doing that here, right? Turning the pencil and creating these things. These kinds of squiggles. Right, and probably right afterwards, these branches, which probably need to go a little bit darker. Unfortunately, my red chalk doesn't have access. It just doesn't go dark enough. We'll see if we can address that a little bit later. We'll see if we can go a little bit darker with the water trick. We're not going to do that right now. We have enough to do. So we're not going to worry ourselves here. Okay, so we have lots of these kind of squiggles. And, okay, so we've got this base tone that we used the Conte red chalk, and then we can go over it and introduce some of those sharp lines. Same thing here, right? You're seeing those sharp lines. See, Fragonard is giving all these complicated surfaces an overall shape and reinforcing forms. Okay, now let's start going inside and getting some of those textures. Again, this red chalk is not quite as dark as it needs to be. I'm not going to get quite the same super dark kind of purplish contrast. It's close. It's close. I do have a red chalk pencil that is a little bit darker. It's this one, which I might sneak in a little bit. But this is almost a colored pencil. I don't particularly like this one. It is a little bit darker. But because it's a harder, waxier material, it ends up not working quite as well. It's basically a sanguine colored pencil. It has very little grit to it. It's too smooth. By the way, if you want to see a review of all the different red chalk pencils in my collection, I have a video, old video, fairly poor image quality, but it's there for you if you want it, if you're curious to see how I compare various red chalk pencils. you can see how the contrast increases as he's working his way down. I am pressing pretty hard here. This is a fairly hard material. I'm really saturating the paper here. Okay, then we have these wonderful trunks. Let's see if we can introduce them. This is just about where our strongest darks are, right here. It's a wonderful passage. Hopefully you can see that as I'm applying the red chalk, it's smoothing out the chalk-based Conte underneath. So this is not a perfect solution. And I'm hoping eventually there's going to be enough interest from the art community that some geologist is going to start looking for higher quality red chalk, because I'm sure it's out there. It's a very, very common material. I think part of the problem is that, yes, the high quality red chalk has been mined out, but because of changing tastes, right, in the 19th century, artists started using charcoal, they started using graphite, they moved away from red chalk. And it wasn't because it had been mined out, it was simply because red chalk was considered kind of a decadent material, right, associated with the Rococo period. Right, and more austere styles of working, think neoclassicism, required monochrome. So there was no interest in looking for new sources of high quality red chalk. And especially nowadays, right, there's no commercial interest in doing so. However, if enough artists start asking for it and art manufacturers see that there's actually a market for it, maybe they'll start going on the hunt, and I'm sure eventually over time someone will discover that there's actually plenty of high quality red chalk left. Maybe not in Italy, but somewhere else. Or we'll discover a synthetic way of making it that is better than this one. That's also a possibility. Okay, so let's start working our way down. And you can see that the textures get stronger, they get darker. And I think so long as I'm working in more or less one layer, right, this oil-based red chalk, it goes pretty dark. It just doesn't layer particularly well, right? It's better in one layer, in two layers, right? Once you apply it very heavily, it seals the paper, right? It just doesn't prevent any more of the material to go on, and has a way of kind of flattening texture. So perhaps one other way that this technique is actually more effective, the fact that the red chalk kind of sits underneath creates grit for the oil-based chalk to kind of sit into. I'm not sure if that's exactly what's happening. Let's imagine that that's the case. So I'm going to go over this just a little bit, just to soften the texture here. It's going a little strong, right? Again, I think one of the main lessons of Fragonard is just how suggestive he is. He's using kind of shorthand to create a very realistic effect. He's not drawing individual leaves. Right, okay, there's a few places here, right, kind of individual leaves. But towards the inside, right, all kinds of textures, all kinds of shapes that sort of mimic, imitate. They don't exactly copy what's actually there. Right, Fragonard is a master of illusion. Again, I'm imagining that these drawings were done very, very quickly, him racing. Fragonard was famous for being incredibly prolific and whipping out his paintings, which, you know, we saw some examples. Right, it's no surprise, right? He's working very, very quickly. And he has this kind of expressionistic, impressionistic way of working. And not to criticize, but you know, his paintings are very formulaic in many ways. So they're sort of variations on a theme. So once you develop a formula, if you don't experiment, if you don't make changes, it becomes fairly easy to repeat yourself. Okay, so let's work on this side a little bit. Let's tone this down just a touch. Because oil-based pencils are harder, it's a little bit easier to control the values little by little. Right? You can make more subtle adjustments. And for this kind of light stuff, a lot easier. Okay, so we've got some branches. Okay, so here I'm going to switch over to a sharpened pencil. These pencils also lose their point fairly quickly. They're not that hard, which is why I recommend you guys have a number of them going. You can have one that's wider, so one that has a chisel point, and then a few that are sharpened, right? And just kind of go through. This way you can work back and forth between sharp detail. I always recommend having a couple of pencils ready to go. Once you're in a drawing, don't allow yourself to pull away by having to sharpen, right? Just have a bunch of pencils ready to go so you stay in the drawing as long as possible. You know, in our highly distractible day and age, practice staying in your work, because that's a skill that needs to be built. Right? This is something that we've lost, right? The ability to just stay in a drawing, or stay at any task for that matter, for long periods of time. We need to retrain ourselves to do it. And this is something that's always very intimidating in artists like Fragonard. Their power of observation, their ability to focus. Right? These artists have razor sharp focus. They can stay in a drawing, get details. They don't get tired, right? You can feel the tremendous energy in this work. They don't tire. They're constantly searching, right? By this point in the drawing, I'm going to be exhausted. I want lunch. I want to take a nap, right? Most importantly, I've turned off my brain. I'm no longer looking. Right? I'm just trying to finish this thing to the best of my ability and go home. Not Fragonard, right? He was a young man, this artist in his early 20s, probably when he was doing this. So I don't have those powers of focus anymore. I get tired quickly. But again, these are things that need to be trained, right? The same way that an endurance athlete, right, can train for hours at a time, right? We have to become endurance artists. Okay, so let's work on these very complicated series of tree trunks. Let's do it. We've got some wonderful textures here. The fact that this was done with a single material is really remarkable. Right? He was using, well, we don't know what he was using, but I suspect he was using a single red chalk. Right? These are done in the field for the most part. Though, you know what, look, red chalk comes in, traditional red chalk, comes in lots of different hardnesses, right? It comes in different colors, depending on where it was mined. It's quite possibly he had a number of different red chalk pencils. It's not outside the realm of possibility. And this is an organic material, which ranges a lot. It can be bright red to a deep purple. Right, these are all versions of red oxide. Okay, so okay, so we're missing a little bit of this tree trunk and this little one here. Okay. Now, I wasn't able to go super dark in certain areas, so I'm trying to go as dark as possible, and look, I might be able to go a little bit darker here. This is where the water trick is going to become incredibly helpful. So I've got a little bit of water, and I'm going to use water to go darker in certain areas. The strange thing that even though this chalk is oil-based, it still responds to water and takes on, hopefully you guys can see this, takes on almost like this purplish quality that doesn't go away. So in some of these areas, we can go a lot darker. Not a lot darker, darker. Right? So we're talking about having darker branches. I suspect that Fragonard used a little bit of wet red chalk here to put in some of those darker branches. Let's see, where else? Maybe here in a few places. Right, definitely here. Right, you can see the color change. Here too. Okay, let's put in a little bit more texture here and there. Okay, I'm missing some details. Okay, now let's put in some of the other stuff in the composition. Again, one of the great things about oil-based red chalk is its fineness of line. This is something that the Conte absolutely cannot do, especially at this scale. So we can put in some of the very delicate trees in the background. And as I'm working on the background, here is another very important principle. Not everything has to be rendered with tremendous detail. The power of suggestion is very important in these kinds of drawings. Right, simply by varying the texture, right, introducing a few lines, Fragonard is doing a tremendous amount of suggesting here. He's not rendering everything. He's not obsessing over detail. Fragonard's ability with just a few strokes to suggest architecture, ruins, create a space that feels like it can be occupied. You can wander through these gardens, these bushes. I mean, I'm filled with nothing but admiration here because there's just barely anything there, and yet it somehow moves, it breathes, there's depth. Part of it is the contrast. Okay, going back to the principle of contrast. The contrast between really tight focused detail and the background here. But this in a lesser artist's hand would feel incomplete. It would feel crude. And I think the main thing is that Fragonard never leaves anything to afterthought. So even though things are way in the distance, even though he's suggesting things a lot, there's still very specific textures. Right? He's really spending time here and thinking about the fact, okay, there's a wall here. There's stairs here, my God. Right? He's indicating a few of the steps here. This is way off in the distance. We've got archways here. A cryptoporticus. My architectural terms are correct. Right, light is hitting this area. There's a direction. There's perspective. All reduced down to just a few squiggly lines. This is really what separates the masters from artists of the second rank. Right? How well they handle things that any lesser artist would just throw away, would just toss out. Like, ah, there's something there. Would treat as filler. Does that make sense? Filler meaning, oh, I just need to fill this area with something and I'll just put something there. No, no, no. Treat nothing as filler. Everything needs to contribute, work together to create a unified effect. Everything should add visual interest. These are things, lessons, that are not exclusive to Fragonard, of course. Right? They're universals. But look, we should, as artists, when we're copying work, seek out universal principles. We don't work like Fragonard. Some of you might. You might be so inspired. Right? We work in a variety of different styles, a variety of different mediums. Some of you guys have never touched red chalk. There are lessons here that go beyond red chalk, however. Right? Way beyond. Principles are universal. They can be applied to oil paint, to acrylic. Okay, let's deal with some of the foreground elements. And again, that idea of nothing being thrown away extends to the foreground. Right? So we've got this figure. It has a very clear, distinct pose to it. We have a figure that is seated. There is no way to use sanguine, the Conte sanguine here for this kind of detail. Right? Impossible. Let me rehone my pencil. Let's get a sharp tip here. We've got a second figure here that's reclining. You can see it catching light. There's a fabric there. Then we have this statuette on a pedestal. There's a plaque on it. There's a light direction. Let's see if I can get it right. Just below it, we have two figures. But you can see Fragonard is leaving us all kinds of wonderful rewards for our close inspection of this drawing. There's a whole universe of things happening here, little moments, little events. This is a complete work, conceptually. In terms of execution, it's a sketch, but conceptually, there's a full narrative here. Which I think is something that we should seek. Right? Whenever we're creating a work of art, whether it's a short sketch, we have to make it complete in its own way, filled with secondary details. with subtlety. That's really the most important thing. Be subtle. That's the main lesson here. Fragonard is being incredibly subtle, fast, but never crude. Always sensitive, always observing. Okay, let's switch back to red chalk because we can. And we can actually use red chalk on top of what we put down. Right? For some reason, because this sanguine has some waxes in it, it doesn't sit perfectly well, but if you wet it, if you add a little bit of water, it can actually go pretty dark. So there's areas where can actually go darker. So I'm not sure why this works, why it's able to stick to our oil-based red chalk. It kind of punches through a little bit. Normally, again, chalky materials and waxy materials, they are not fantastic bedfellows. They don't play well with each other. All right, so you do have to be careful how you do this. This might not work quite as well if you attempt it with a figure drawing, but for something like this, it just happens to work. Okay, let's do a little bit of the foreground with our sanguine. So we're going to introduce a touch of shadow here. Let's do it. We're going to use the side of our pencil here. And throw the entire foreground into a light, not quite a halftone, almost a halftone. And we have these really flat, wide strokes. This is what the sanguine up. You can feel there's a little scratch in there, a little inclusion. And come right back in with our red chalk, our oil-based red chalk. We can smooth out the texture and then start introducing details. Again, from a distance, everything seems to come together. There's grass, there's rocks, there's all kinds of stuff going on. Up close, there's nothing. Fragonard is being incredibly suggestive here with his detail. Bunch of squiggles, but specific squiggles. He is creating a sense that there is a bush with sort of sharp leaves, almost spiky leaves, that's getting hit by light. There's a shadow on this side. He's definitely using a lot of water here to go darker. You can use a little bit of water here on these figures. Right? He's really trying to define them as one of the areas of focus. Again, I like to move around. Something catches my eye. I left this area a little bit incomplete. I think one thing you'll find is that different textures are more effectively created by holding your pencil a different way. So you may have noticed that sometimes I'm holding the pencil way back like this. That allows me to get an angle. Sometimes I'm holding it this way. Right? That allows me to create these kinds of textures. towards the foreground. Right? This is something that oil painters do often. They hold their brushes in all kinds of strange ways. Right? Sometimes they use flat brushes or brushes of all different kinds of shapes, right? Particularly for organic textures. You don't always have to hold your brush or your drawing material in a classical way that's depicted in the drawing manuals. Sometimes it's helpful to hold your pencil at a really strange angle. Often you'll see me in my pen and ink work, I'll hold the pen way back like this, like completely against the rules. Right? If I was a calligrapher in a class of calligraphy, the instructor would slap me with a ruler across the wrists. Right? For artists, that's okay. We're allowed to do it. Okay, and just for the last step, I'm going to go in with some water with the Conte because it goes even darker. Right, these chalk-based red chalks are more responsive to water than the oil-based. They go even darker. Right, so some of these darker shadows can be put in. With the chalk base. Okay, so as a last step, let's put in a little bit of the sky. So we're going to use our Conte, we're going to use our oil base pencil for that. And use it sideways to create very, very light, soft strokes. And again, even here, Fragonard is being specific about the shapes of the clouds, creating movement in the composition. Nothing is afterthought, nothing is thrown away. Nothing is of secondary importance. Everything is treated with equal attention. Not with equal detail, obviously, but equal attention. So lots of short, flat, soft, energetic strokes. Focus on energetic. Okay, so before we complete this tutorial, let's do a few additional things. We can use a few stronger darks here and there. So let's use a little bit of this wet sanguine to put in some stronger darks. I think they're missing. And I recognize that this copy is far from complete. Right, I'm doing what I can within the limited time. I can't spend hours and hours and hours doing this copy for you guys. I'll put all of you to sleep. And then I'm going to see if I can correct a little bit of a mistake in this drawing, the fact that there's this lighter value here. Now, this technique, especially at this stage, is not particularly correctable, but it is adjustable. So if I want to lighten an area without blurring it, without completely erasing it, you can use a little bit of a kneaded eraser. So what I'm going to do is just tap at the drawing. It's going to erase material without blurring, without blending. So I put it down and I lift it up, and hopefully well, as you can see, right, that's a pretty effective way of going lighter. So that's a really good way of, for example, throwing the background more into the background or making the sky softer. Did Fragonard have access to a kneaded eraser? No, but they used breadcrumbs for that purpose, or soft bread. So they would take the crumb of the bread and press it against the drawing and make erasing, sometimes adjustments. So while kneaded erasers were not around, this is before the invention of rubber, or the discovery of rubber, they did have access to all kinds of correcting techniques. Okay, I think for the sake of the demo, I'm going to call this copy complete. It's not perfect, and this is actually my second version. So in preparation for this copy, I did this one where I made a few mistakes. I think this is the improved version. I don't know what you guys think. Now, the next step in this process is to, once again, think about what principles can be applied to your own work, and then experiment by doing a drawing of your own, using your own subject matter, with those principles in mind. That's what I'm going to do next, and that video I'm going to reserve for members of my YouTube membership program. And if you want to view that video, please join. So my membership program, if you guys don't know about it, for a small monthly fee, members get access to a really long library of long-form tutorials. I think there are 32 tutorials at this point, and 2 new tutorials every single month. That's something that I've promised and I've delivered on ever since the membership program started. So that video is going to be reserved for channel members. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your patience, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.